The winter sun hung low over the Colorado Territory, casting long shadows across the frost-brittle grass that stretched endlessly toward the snow-capped mountains. A bitter wind swept through the valley, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and impending darkness. The town of Redemption Creek huddled against the approaching night, its weathered buildings standing like weary sentinels against the wilderness beyond. Main Street was little more than a muddy track lined with false-fronted shops and saloons, their windows glowing amber in the fading light. Horses stood tethered to hitching posts, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The usual evening sounds, the tinny piano from the Silver Dollar Saloon, the creak of wagon wheels, the occasional burst of laughter, seemed muted, as if the town itself held its breath. At the center of it all, in the dusty square before the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Men in worn coats and battered hats stood shoulder to shoulder with women wrapped in shawls, their faces hard as the frozen ground beneath their boots. Children peered between the adults, eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear. The object of their attention stood on a makeshift platform, a young woman, barely past her 20th winter. Her name was Grace Morrison, though few in the crowd knew it or cared to remember. Her wrists were bound before her with rough rope that had already rubbed her skin raw. Her dress, once a modest blue calico, was torn at the shoulder, and her dark hair had come loose from its pins, falling in tangled strands around a face pale with terror. "Bring forth the iron," commanded Judge Bartholomew Crane, a man whose righteousness sat upon him like an ill-fitting coat. His voice carried across the square with the weight of absolute authority. The blacksmith, a giant of a man named Otto Bergman, emerged from the crowd carrying a branding iron, its tip glowing cherry red from the forge. The sight of it sent a ripple of anticipation through the gathered townspeople. Some leaned forward eagerly. Others turned their faces away. Grace's legs trembled, but she forced herself to remain standing. She had protested her innocence until her voice was hoarse, but her words had fallen on deaf ears. The evidence, a gold pocket watch belonging to Mr. Silas Brennan, the town's most prosperous merchant, found hidden beneath the floorboards of the boarding house where she worked as a chambermaid, had been damning. "Grace Morrison," the judge intoned, his voice carrying the finality of a funeral bell. "You have been found guilty of theft, a crime against the good people of this community who took you in when you had nothing. The law demands justice." "I didn't take it," Grace's voice cracked, but she raised it nonetheless. "Please, I've told you, I don't know how it got there." "Silence." The judge's fist came down on his makeshift podium. "The evidence speaks louder than your lies. You will bear the mark of your shame, so all who meet you will know what you are." The crowd pressed closer. Grace could smell their collective breath. Whiskey, tobacco, and something darker. Bloodlust barely contained beneath a veneer of civilization. She recognized faces among them. Mrs. Hartley from the general store, who had always been kind to her. Tom Sullivan, the banker's son who had once asked her to dance. Even Mary Beth, another girl from the boarding house who had shared her morning coffee just yesterday. Now they all watched with the same cold fascination. Otto approached. The brand held steady in his massive hand. The iron was shaped to form a single word: thief. The heat radiating from it made the air shimmer. "The shoulder," Judge Crane directed. "Let it be seen." Rough hands tore at Grace's dress, exposing her left shoulder to the winter air. She bit down hard on her lip, tasting blood, determined not to cry out. She would not give them that satisfaction. The iron descended. Time seemed to slow. Grace could see every detail: the pitted surface of the metal, the small sparks that danced from its edge, the reflection of her own terrified face in Otto's emotionless eyes. Then came the pain. It was beyond anything she had imagined, a white-hot agony that shot through her shoulder and down her arm, stealing her breath and blackening the edges of her vision. The smell of burning flesh filled her nostrils. Despite her resolution, a scream tore from her throat, raw and primal. The brand was held for 3 eternal seconds before Otto pulled it away. Grace's knees buckled, but the men holding her arms kept her upright. displaying her to the crowd like a trophy. "Let this be a lesson," Judge Crane announced, his voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. "Redemption Creek is a town of honest, God-fearing people. We will not tolerate thieves, liars, or any who would disturb our peace." Grace lifted her head, tears streaming down her face, and looked at the judge. In that moment, she saw him clearly, not as the pillar of justice he pretended to be, but as a small, frightened man clinging to power like a drowning person clutches at straws. "You're making a mistake," she whispered, but her words were lost in the wind. The judge gestured dismissively. "Cut her loose. She has until sunset to leave Redemption Creek. If she's found within town limits after dark, she'll face the noose." The ropes binding her wrists were severed. Grace stumbled, catching herself before she fell. The crowd parted before her, creating a path that led to the town's edge. Some spat at her feet as she passed. Others simply stared, their faces masks of righteous satisfaction. Grace walked that gauntlet with what dignity she could muster, each step an agony as the movement pulled at her burned shoulder. The sun had nearly touched the mountains now, painting the sky in shades of blood and ash. She had perhaps an hour before full dark. At the boarding house, Mrs. Pratt, the proprietor, had already packed Grace's few belongings into a worn canvas sack. She thrust it at her without meeting her eyes. "Your pay through yesterday," the woman said, pressing a few coins into Grace's hand. It was less than what she was owed. But Grace didn't argue. There was no point. Grace changed into her warmest dress, a brown wool that had seen better days, and wrapped her mother's shawl around her shoulders, wincing as the fabric touched her burn. She had no coat. It had been sold months ago to pay for medicine when she'd taken ill. As she reached the town limits, marked by a weather-beaten sign that proclaimed Redemption Creek, population 847, Grace turned back one final time. The town that had been her home for 2 years looked foreign to her now, its windows glowing with warmth she would never again share. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. To the west, the mountains loomed like sleeping giants, their peaks already lost in shadow. The wind picked up, cutting through her dress as if it were made of paper. Grace had nowhere to go, no family, no friends beyond the town that had just cast her out. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of grass and snow that could swallow a person whole. In the distance, she heard the first howl. A wolf, perhaps, or a coyote. The sound sent ice through her veins colder than any winter wind. But what choice did she have? Behind her lay certain death. Ahead, at least the possibility of survival. She pulled her shawl tighter, gritted her teeth against the pain in her shoulder, and walked into the gathering darkness. The wound throbbed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder of the injustice that had been done to her. But beneath the pain, beneath the fear and despair, something else stirred, a tiny spark of anger that refused to be extinguished. They had branded her a thief, marked her with shame for all to see. They had taken everything from her based on a lie, but they had not broken her. Not yet. The town disappeared behind a rise in the land, and Grace was alone with the vast indifference of the frontier. The temperature was dropping rapidly. She could feel frost forming on her eyelashes, could see her breath in thick clouds that the wind snatched away. She needed shelter, and soon the boarding house had been stifling, but now she would have given anything for its warmth. Her feet, in their thin boots, were already numb. The burn on her shoulder had settled into a deep, pulsing ache that seemed to reach into her very bones. As she struggled forward, memories arose unbidden. Her parents' farm in Kansas, before the drought and disease had taken everything. The promise of a new start in Redemption Creek. The quiet satisfaction of honest work and wages earned. All of it ashes now, scattered on the unforgiving wind. The howling came again, closer this time. Grace quickened her pace. Though she had no destination in mind, the prairie offered no comfort, no refuge, only endless space beneath an increasingly hostile sky. The night descended upon the prairie like a living thing, hungry and cold. Grace had been walking for hours, though time had lost all meaning in the darkness. The stars above offered light but no warmth, their distant brilliance only emphasizing her isolation. The wind had become a constant torment, finding every gap in her clothing, every exposed inch of skin. Her shoulder burned with fever now, the brand pulsing with each labored heartbeat. She could feel the heat radiating from the wound even as the rest of her body shivered uncontrollably. The thin boots she wore had soaked through from the snow, and she could no longer feel her toes. Ahead, barely visible in the starlight, a cluster of rocks rose from the prairie like broken teeth. Grace stumbled toward them, her legs barely responding to her will. The rocks formed a natural shelter of sorts, not a cave exactly, but an overhang that would at least break the wind. She collapsed beneath the stone outcropping, her breath coming in ragged gasps that sent white clouds into the frigid air. Her hands were so numb she could barely grip the canvas sack containing her few possessions. With stiff fingers, she pulled out everything she had, a change of undergarments, a small sewing kit, a Bible that had been her mother's, and a thin blanket that seemed pitifully inadequate against the cold. Grace wrapped the blanket around herself, pulling her knees to her chest. The movement sent fresh waves of agony through her shoulder, and she bit back a cry. The burn needed tending, but she had nothing. No salve, no bandages, not even clean water. The howling came again. Closer now. Multiple voices joined the chorus, and Grace pressed herself deeper into the rocky shelter. She had heard stories of wolf packs in winter, driven by hunger to overcome their natural fear of humans. Her hand fumbled for something, anything that might serve as a weapon, but found only loose stones. As the fever took hold, her mind began to wander. She was 8 years old again, sitting by the hearth in their Kansas farmhouse while her mother sang softly and mended clothes. Her father's large hands were gentle as he whittled a wooden doll for her birthday. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars. "You're strong, Gracie." Her father's voice echoed across the years. "Morrison women always have been. When times get hard, we don't break, we bend. But we don't break." The memory shattered as a sound, different from the wind or wolves, reached her ears. Footsteps, deliberate, measured, crunching through the snow. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. Had someone from town followed her? Had they decided exile wasn't punishment enough? A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in this wilderness. He wore a long coat of buffalo hide and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. A rifle rested easily in the crook of his arm. Grace pressed herself against the rock, trying to become invisible, but her chattering teeth betrayed her. The man stopped, his head turning toward her shelter. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he approached slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal. "Easy there," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. "Not here to hurt you." In the starlight, Grace could make out weathered features, a dark beard streaked with premature gray, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He appeared to be in his 30s, with the kind of face that had seen too much too young. "Please," Grace whispered through cracked lips. "I have nothing to steal." The man's gaze traveled over her huddled form, pausing at the torn shoulder of her dress where the burn was visible. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Didn't say you did," he replied. He set down a pack he'd been carrying and pulled out a bundle. "You'll be dead by morning without a fire." Grace watched, too exhausted to protest, as he gathered dried grass and twigs with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, he had coaxed a small flame to life in a circle of stones. The warmth hit her like a physical blow, and she couldn't suppress a sob of relief. The man, he hadn't offered his name, unrolled a heavy bearskin from his pack and held it out to her. "This'll do better than that scrap you're wrapped in." Pride warred with survival instinct. Survival won. Grace reached for the skin with trembling hands, wrapping it around herself. It smelled of smoke and pine and something wild. but it was blessedly warm. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded, then turned his attention to a small pot he'd produced from his pack. Soon, the smell of brewing coffee filled their small shelter. He poured a measure into a battered tin cup and handed it to her. The first sip burned her throat, but the warmth that followed was worth it. Grace clutched the cup with both hands, letting the heat seep into her frozen fingers. "That brand's fresh," the man observed. Not quite a question. Grace's hand moved instinctively to her shoulder. "Today, this afternoon. Redemption Creek." She nodded. "Figures." He spat into the fire. "That town's got a peculiar notion of justice." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. The wolves had gone quiet, perhaps discouraged by the flame and human presence. Grace found herself studying her unlikely savior. His hands, visible in the firelight, were scarred but steady. A Colt revolver rode his hip, and the rifle was never far from reach. "You got a name?" she asked finally. "Folks call me Ezra. Ezra Hawkins." He pulled out a pouch of tobacco and began rolling a cigarette. "Don't suppose you'll be sharing yours?" "Grace Morrison." There seemed no point in lying. Former chambermaid, current exile, branded thief. The bitterness in her voice surprised her. Former chambermaid. Maybe. The rest remains to be seen. Ezra lit his cigarette with a twig from the fire. "You take what they said you took?" "No." The word came out firm despite her exhaustion. "Someone put Mr. Brennan's watch under my floorboards. I never saw it before they found it there." Ezra studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you." Those 3 simple words hit Grace harder than any blow. She'd proclaimed her innocence to judge, jury, and townspeople, and not one had believed her. This stranger's quiet acceptance broke something inside her, and the tears came. Hot, silent streams down her face. Ezra didn't comfort her or look away. He simply tended the fire and let her cry. When the storm passed, he refilled her coffee cup. "That shoulder needs tending," he said. "Infection sets in. You'll lose the arm, or worse." Grace knew he was right. The burn throbbed constantly now, and she could feel heat radiating from it even in the cold night air. "I have nothing to treat it with." Ezra rummaged in his pack again, producing a small leather pouch. "Pine sap and bear grease. Best I can offer out here." He hesitated. "You'll need to let me see it proper." Grace understood the propriety being breached, but propriety seemed a luxury she could no longer afford. She nodded, loosening the shawl and dress to expose the brand. Ezra's expression remained neutral as he examined the wound, but Grace saw his jaw tighten. "They heated it too long," he said quietly. "Wanted to make sure it scarred deep." His touch was surprisingly gentle as he applied the salve. Grace hissed at the contact but forced herself to remain still. The mixture was cooling, soothing, though she knew the relief was temporary. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as he worked. "Man sees someone in trouble in this country. He helps. That's the only law that matters out here." He finished with the salve and helped her adjust her clothing. "Besides, I've got no love for Redemption Creek." "You know the town?" "Used to." His voice carried weight, old pain compressed into 2 words. "That's a story for another time." Grace wanted to press, but exhaustion was pulling her down like quicksand. The warmth of the fire, the bear skin, and the first kindness she'd experienced in days combined to make her eyelids impossibly heavy. "Sleep," Ezra said. "I'll keep watch. The wolves won't come near the fire, and if they do, they'll find me a harder meal than they bargained for." Grace believed him. There was something about this man, a quiet competence, a familiarity with violence held in check. She surrendered to sleep, her last conscious thought a prayer of gratitude for this unlikely sanctuary. She dreamed again of home, but this time the memories were sharper, edged with loss. Her mother's face, gaunt with illness, still managing a smile. Her father's hands, shaking with fever as he gripped hers one last time. The auction where their neighbors had bought everything they owned for pennies on the dollar. The long walk to town, carrying nothing but memories and determination to start over. When she woke, gray dawn light was seeping across the prairie. The fire had been kept burning through the night, and the smell of cooking meat made her stomach clench with hunger. Ezra sat where she'd last seen him, looking as if he hadn't moved, but she could see the watchfulness in his posture. "Morning," he said without turning. "Storm's coming in from the north. We'll need to move if you're able." Grace sat up slowly, assessing her condition. The shoulder still hurt, but the burning sensation had lessened. Her feet ached as feeling returned to them, but she could move. She was alive, which was more than she'd expected when the sun set yesterday. "Where?" she asked. "Got a place about a day's walk, nothing fancy, but it's got walls and a roof." He handed her a piece of cooked rabbit. "Eat. You'll need your strength." As Grace ate the first real food she'd had in over a day, she studied the man who'd saved her life. In daylight, she could see more clearly the lines etched into his face, the careful way he moved, always aware of his surroundings. This was someone who'd learned to survive outside civilization's boundaries, perhaps even preferred it. She thought of the brand on her shoulder, the way the townspeople had looked at her, the satisfaction in Judge Crane's voice, that life was closed to her now. But perhaps, in this harsh and unforgiving wilderness, there might be another way forward. "Thank you," she said again, meaning more than just the food and fire. Ezra finally looked at her directly, and she saw understanding in his dark eyes. We all need help sometimes, even those of us who've forgotten how to ask for it. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of snow. Grace struggled to her feet, muscles protesting. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than freezing to death alone on the prairie. And perhaps, with this silent hunter as her guide, she might survive long enough to prove her innocence, or find a new kind of justice entirely. The morning sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold, a beauty that seemed almost cruel given Grace's circumstances. They had been walking for hours, following a path only Ezra could see through the pristine wilderness. The promised storm held off, but clouds gathered on the northern horizon like an advancing army. Grace struggled to match Ezra's steady pace. Each step jarred her wounded shoulder, but she refused to complain. The bearskin he'd insisted she keep wrapped around her was heavy but warm, and she'd learned to be grateful for small mercies. They followed a frozen stream that wound between stands of pine and aspen. Ice crystals hung from the bare branches like nature's chandelier, tinkling softly in the breeze. Despite everything, Grace found herself moved by the raw beauty of this untamed land. "There," Ezra said, pointing to a break in the trees. "We'll rest a spell." The clearing he'd chosen was sheltered by a massive fallen log, its roots forming a natural windbreak. Grace sank gratefully onto a relatively dry spot, while Ezra gathered kindling with the same quiet efficiency he seemed to bring to every task. "You know this country well," Grace observed, accepting the piece of jerky he offered. "Been walking these mountains near 15 years. He struck flint to steel, coaxing flame from tinder. "A man learns the land, or the land claims him. 15 years is a long time to be alone." Ezra's hand stilled for a moment. "Who says I'm alone?" Grace flushed, realizing her presumption. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "No offense taken." He fed small twigs to the growing flame. "Truth is, I choose to be easier that way." They sat in companionable silence as the fire grew. Grace watched him work, noting the economy of his movements, the careful way he conserved resources. Everything about him spoke of hard-won survival skills. "Why did you leave?" she asked finally. "Redemption Creek. I mean—" Ezra was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "Had a family once, wife, daughter, lived just outside town, trying to make a go of ranching." Grace waited, sensing the importance of this revelation. "Caught some rustlers one night, bunch of cowboys from the Triple Bar Ranch. Shot one in the shoulder when he drew on me. Turned out he was the foreman's nephew." Ezra's jaw tightened. They came back 3 nights later. I was in town, getting supplies. He didn't need to finish. Grace could read the rest in the lines of his face, the way his hand unconsciously moved toward his rifle. The law? She asked softly. Judge Crane said there was no evidence. The Triple Bar boys all swore they were playing cards in the saloon that night. He spat into the fire. That's when I learned the difference between law and justice. Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. So, you came here. These mountains don't lie. Don't pretend to be something they're not. A man knows where he stands. He looked at her directly. Sometimes that's all you can ask for. They resumed walking as the sun climbed higher. Ezra pointed out signs Grace would have missed. Deer tracks, bear scat from the fall, the scratches on trees where elk had rubbed their antlers. He showed her which plants remained edible even in winter, how to read the weather in the cloud formations. See that? He indicated a particularly gnarled pine. Lightning struck, but still growing. Trees know something about surviving that people forget. As the day wore on, Ezra began teaching her practical skills. How to walk quietly in snow, placing her feet in his tracks to conserve energy. How to find dry wood even after a snowfall. How to watch for the subtle signs of predators. Mountain cats especially, he warned. They'll track you for miles, waiting for weakness. Make noise when you walk through heavy cover. They prefer surprise. Grace absorbed every lesson, understanding that this knowledge might mean the difference between life and death. Her shoulder still ached, but the regular application of Ezra's salve was helping. She could feel the wound beginning to heal, though she knew the scar would be permanent. Near midday, they stopped by a partially frozen stream. Ezra showed her how to break the ice safely, how to strain water through cloth to remove debris. As Grace knelt to fill the canteen, she caught her reflection in the dark water and gasped. The woman looking back was a stranger, hair tangled and wild, face smudged with dirt and ash from the campfire, eyes holding a hardness that hadn't been there before. The torn dress and rough bearskin completed the transformation. She looked like someone who belonged in this wilderness. Takes some getting used to, Ezra said quietly. Seeing who you become out here. Grace touched her reflection, watching it ripple and break apart. I'm not sure I know who that is anymore. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Sometimes we need to lose who we were to find who we are. They climbed steadily through the afternoon, the terrain growing rougher. Grace's legs burned with effort, but she pushed on, driven by a combination of necessity and growing pride. Each successful stream crossing, each steep slope conquered, felt like a small victory. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Ezra led her up a particularly challenging ridge. Grace's breath came in gasps by the time they reached the top, but the view stole what little air remained in her lungs. The valley spread below them like a painting snow-covered meadows broken by dark stands of evergreen, a silver ribbon of river winding through it all. Mountains rose on every side, their peaks touching clouds turned gold and pink by the setting sun. It's beautiful, she breathed. Wait until spring. Whole valley turns green, wildflowers everywhere. Elk bring their calves down to graze. Bears come out with their cubs. A rare smile softened Ezra's features. Almost makes a man forget why he came here in the first place. Almost. The smile faded. Some things aren't meant to be forgotten, just carried different. As they descended into the valley, Grace spotted what looked like a cabin nestled against the far tree line. It was small, built of logs chinked with mud, with a stone chimney already releasing a thin stream of smoke. You said you were alone, Grace said, confused. Set the fire this morning before I left, banked it low. He glanced at her. Knew I'd be bringing back company. How could you know that? Didn't know, but storms were coming, and folks in trouble tend to head for the rocks. Been checking that outcrop regular since the first snow. They approached the cabin as full darkness fell. It was sturdy and well built, with thick walls and a solid door. A lean-to on one side sheltered split firewood, and Grace could see the entrance to what might be a root cellar. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves holding supplies. Furs hung on the walls for extra insulation, and the floor was covered with worn but serviceable rugs. Ezra stirred the banked fire back to life, adding logs until warmth filled the space. Grace stood uncertainly near the door, acutely aware that she was in a man's private space. "Sit," Ezra said, indicating one of the chairs. "This is shelter, nothing more or less. You're safe here." Grace sank into the chair, exhaustion hitting her all at once. The warmth, the solid walls, the absence of wind. It all combined to make her feel almost drunk with relief. Ezra moved efficiently around the small space, heating water, preparing a simple meal from his stores. He set a bowl of stew before her, venison, wild onions, and roots she couldn't identify but that tasted of earth and sustenance. "Thank you," Grace said, meaning everything. The rescue, the shelter, the human kindness when she'd expected none. "Eat," was all he said. "Tomorrow we'll see about making you some proper wilderness clothes. That dress won't last another day out here." As Grace ate, she watched him tend to various tasks, checking his rifle, mending a tear in a leather pouch, all the small necessities of frontier life. There was something deeply calming about his methodical movements, the quiet competence with which he navigated his chosen exile. "I can work," Grace said suddenly. "I won't be a burden. I can cook, mend, tend the fire." "Wasn't worried about that." Ezra looked up from his work. "But this isn't a permanent solution. Soon as the weather breaks, we'll need to figure out what comes next for you." Grace's hand moved unconsciously to her shoulder. "I can't go back. Not to any town, not with this mark. Marks fade. Truth has a way of coming out, given time." "You believe that? After what happened to you?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment. "I believe in survival first. Justice. That's a luxury for those who can afford to wait." He met her eyes. "Question is, what do you believe in?" Grace considered the question as the fire crackled and the wind sang its lonely song outside. Yesterday, she'd believed in hard work and honest living. Today, she wasn't sure what she believed, except that she was alive when she shouldn't be, sitting in a warm cabin with a man who understood loss and injustice as intimately as she did. "I believe," she said slowly, "that I want to learn everything you can teach me about surviving out here, and then maybe I'll be strong enough to decide what comes next." Ezra nodded, a gesture of acceptance and perhaps approval. "Fair enough. Lessons start at dawn. These mountains don't coddle anyone, but they're honest teachers." As Grace prepared for sleep on a pallet of furs by the fire, she thought about the strange turns her life had taken, from farmhouse to boarding house to the wilderness, each change forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control. But here, in this rough cabin with its taciturn guardian, she sensed the possibility of something new, not just survival, but transformation. The brand on her shoulder still ached, would probably always ache on cold nights, but it no longer felt like an ending. Perhaps Ezra was right. Perhaps she needed to lose who she had been, the obedient servant, the victim of others' greed, to discover who she could become. Outside, something howled in the darkness, but the sound no longer terrified her. She was learning the language of the wilderness, and in its harsh vocabulary, she might yet find words for redemption that no judge or jury could grant. The days had folded into one another like pages in a book, each one teaching Grace something new about survival and herself. A week had passed since Ezra found her dying in the snow, and the woman who now moved through the cabin bore little resemblance to the frightened chambermaid of Redemption Creek. Tonight was different. The promised storm had finally arrived in full force, trapping them inside as wind howled like a living thing and snow piled against the walls. The cabin creaked and groaned but held firm, testament to Ezra's careful construction. Grace sat by the fire, mending a tear in the elk-hide shirt Ezra had helped her fashion. Her fingers, once soft from indoor work, had grown calloused but deft. She found unexpected satisfaction in the simple task, in creating something useful with her own hands. "You're getting good at that," Ezra observed from across the room, where he was cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. Had a good teacher, Grace replied, not looking up from her work. The past week had been an education in frontier living. Ezra had shown her how to set snares for rabbits, how to read animal signs, how to find her direction by the stars. He'd taught her to shoot, patiently correcting her stance and grip until she could hit a target at 50 paces. Her shoulder had protested at first, the healing burn pulling with each recoil. But she'd persevered. The storm intensified, driving snow against the windows with a sound like thrown sand. The fire flared as wind found its way down the chimney, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Tell me about your life," Ezra said suddenly. "Before Redemption Creek." Grace's needle paused. They'd spoken little of personal matters since that first night, focusing instead on the practical necessities of survival. But the storm had created an intimacy, a sense of being cut off from the world that made secrets seem foolish. "Not much to tell," she began, then reconsidered. He'd shared his pain with her. She owed him the same honesty. "My parents had a farm in Kansas, good land, until the drought came. 3 years without proper rain. Watched the corn wither, the cattle die one by one." She resumed her sewing, finding it easier to speak while her hands were busy. "Fever took them both the winter I turned 18. Cholera, the doctor said, though he couldn't do much but watch them die. I sold everything to pay debts and burial costs. Had enough left for stage fare to Colorado Territory." Why Redemption Creek? Saw an advertisement for chambermaid positions. "Respectable work for virtuous women," it said. Grace laughed bitterly. Should have known virtue was negotiable when money was involved. "The watch," Ezra prompted gently. Grace set down her sewing, staring into the fire. "Silas Brennan had been attentive, made comments when his wife wasn't around, found excuses to be wherever I was cleaning. I refused his advances, politely at first, then firmly when he persisted. Man like that doesn't take rejection well." "No," Grace agreed. "The watch appeared under my floorboards 2 days after I threatened to tell his wife about his wandering hands. Sheriff found it within an hour of the accusation being made. Almost like someone told him exactly where to look." Ezra's expression darkened. "Brennan's got the sheriff in his pocket. Probably the judge, too. The whole town. More like he holds mortgages on half the businesses, extends credit to the rest. Cross him, and suddenly your notes are due, your credit's cut off." Grace picked up the needle again, stabbing through the hide with more force than necessary. "I was nobody, no family, no connections, no money for lawyers. The perfect person to make an example of." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Grace had learned to appreciate Ezra's silences. They weren't empty but full of thought, of a kind of companionship that didn't require constant words. "I need to tell you the rest," Grace said finally, "about why I can't go back, even if my name was cleared." Ezra waited, patient as always. The boarding house, some of the girls supplemented their income by entertaining gentlemen callers. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks but pressed on. "I never did, but after the trial, everyone assumed. They branded me a thief, but in their minds, I was something worse. Even if Brennan confessed tomorrow, that suspicion would follow me forever." "People love their scandals," Ezra agreed. "Easier to believe the worst than admit they might be wrong." The wind picked up, howling like a wounded animal. Snow had covered the windows completely, turning the cabin into a warm cave isolated from the world. Grace finished her mending and held up the shirt, examining her work in the firelight. "You've taken to this life," Ezra observed. "Not everyone does. I didn't have much choice. There's always a choice. Some would have given up, let the cold take them. Others would have grown bitter, hard." He studied her across the room. "You've grown stronger instead." Grace considered this. It was true that she felt different, not just in her capabilities, but in her understanding of herself. The woman who had scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots seemed like a stranger now, someone too concerned with propriety and others' opinions. "Maybe I was always meant for this," she said. My grandmother used to tell stories about her mother, who came west in the early days. Said she could shoot better than any man, and once faced down a bear with nothing but a cooking pot and fierce language. Mountain blood, Ezra said with something that might have been approval. It was always in you, waiting. The storm showed no signs of abating. Ezra added more wood to the fire, then surprised Grace by pulling out a small, leather-wrapped package from a shelf. "Been saving this for a special occasion," he said, unwrapping it to reveal a chess set, the pieces carved from light and dark wood with patient skill. "You made these?" "Long winters leave time for such things." He set up the board on the small table. "Do you play?" "My father taught me." Grace moved to sit across from him, memories flooding back of quiet evenings in Kansas. The click of pieces on the board, her father's gentle corrections of her strategy. They played in companionable quiet, the storm providing a dramatic backdrop. Grace found herself studying Ezra's face as he contemplated moves. The lamplight softened his weathered features, and she could see the younger man he'd been before loss drove him to these mountains. "Check," she announced, moving her bishop into position. Ezra's eyebrows rose slightly, the most surprise she'd seen him show. He studied the board, then moved his king to safety. "You're full of surprises, Grace Morrison." "I could say the same about you, Ezra Hawkins." Their eyes met across the board, and something shifted in the air between them. Grace felt her heart quicken, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the isolation, the strange intimacy of being two souls sheltering together while nature raged outside. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a recognition between two people who had been broken by the world and chosen to remake themselves rather than surrender. Ezra looked away first, focusing on the board. "Your move." They played 3 games, Grace winning one through a clever sacrifice of her queen that Ezra hadn't seen coming. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to lighter things, books they'd read, places they'd dreamed of seeing, small memories that had survived the larger griefs. "Always wanted to see the ocean," Ezra admitted. "Heard tell of waves tall as houses, water stretching to the horizon with no end in sight." "I wanted to see a city," Grace countered. "Building so tall you have to crane your neck to see the top. More people on one street than in all of Redemption Creek. Cities are overrated. Too many people trying to be something they're not. And yet here we are, 2 people arguably being something we weren't born to be." Ezra's rare smile appeared. "Difference is, we're not pretending. This is who we are now, for better or worse." As the night deepened, the storm began to exhaust itself. The wind still moaned, but with less conviction. Grace knew that by morning. The world outside would be transformed, familiar landmarks buried under snow, paths erased, everything made new and strange. "I should thank you," she said suddenly. "Not just for saving my life, but for showing me I could be more than what others decided I was." Ezra was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. "Maybe you've done the same for me. Been a long time since I remembered there was more to life than just surviving another day." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Grace felt something flutter in her chest. Hope, perhaps, or the first stirring of a feeling she hadn't expected to experience again. "One more thing," Ezra said, standing abruptly. He went to a trunk in the corner, returning with something wrapped in oilcloth. "This is yours now." Grace unwrapped it to find a hunting knife in a leather sheath, the blade sharp and well-balanced, the handle worn smooth from use. "Was my wife's," Ezra said quietly. "She'd want someone to have it who'd use it proper, someone who understands that strength isn't about never falling, it's about getting back up." Grace's throat tightened. She understood the magnitude of the gift, not just the knife, but the trust it represented. "Ezra, storm's breaking," he said, turning away. "Should be able to hunt tomorrow if the snow's not too deep. Best get some sleep." But as Grace settled onto her pallet by the fire, the knife close at hand, she found sleep elusive. The wind had gentled to a whisper, and she could hear Ezra's steady breathing from across the room. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing on the walls. She thought about the brand on her shoulder, hidden now beneath the elk hide but always present. It had marked her as an outcast, someone beyond the protection of society. But perhaps that casting out had been a twisted kind of gift. Here in the wilderness, with a man who understood exile and had chosen it over compromise, she was discovering parts of herself that comfortable conformity would never have revealed. The storm was passing, but Grace sensed another kind of weather building, something just as powerful but far more dangerous to the walls she'd built around her heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons in survival. But tonight, in this warm cabin while snow erased the outside world, she allowed herself to imagine possibilities beyond mere survival. As sleep finally claimed her, Grace's last thought was of Ezra's words from that first night. We all need help sometimes, even those of us who've forgotten how to ask for it. Perhaps they were both remembering how to ask. Perhaps that was the most dangerous lesson of all. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pines as Grace checked the last of her snares. 3 rabbits today, a good haul that would keep them fed for several days. She moved through the forest with growing confidence, her footsteps nearly as quiet as Ezra's now, reading the subtle signs of the wilderness like a familiar language. 2 weeks had passed since the storm. 2 weeks of deepening winter and deepening something else. Something that made her heart race when Ezra's hand accidentally brushed hers. Something that filled the cabin with an electric tension neither acknowledged directly. She was resetting the snare when she heard it, the crack of a breaking branch, too heavy to be mere wind or small game. Grace froze, hand moving instinctively to the knife at her belt. Ezra had taught her well. When something feels wrong in the forest, trust your instincts. Another sound. Closer now. Deliberate footsteps trying to be quiet but failing. Not Ezra. She knew his gait, the particular rhythm of his movement through the trees. Grace eased behind a thick pine, controlling her breathing as he'd shown her. A man emerged from the underbrush, rifle in hand, scanning the forest floor, a trapper by his looks, with a full beard and clothes that had seen better seasons. But it was his eyes that made Grace shrink deeper into concealment, cold, calculating, the eyes of someone who saw opportunity where others saw only wilderness. He was following her tracks. Grace weighed her options. The cabin was a half-mile east, but leading him there was unthinkable. West would take her into rougher terrain where she might lose him. North led to the canyon. Dangerous, but she knew the paths now. The trapper paused, kneeling to examine the disturbed snow where she'd collected the rabbits. His head came up sharply, nostrils flaring as if he could scent her presence. Grace made her decision. She moved swift and silent, using every skill Ezra had taught her. Behind her, she heard a muffled curse as the trapper spotted her fleeing form. The chase was on. Grace ran with purpose, not panic. She leaped a frozen stream, ducked under low-hanging branches, always choosing the path that would be hardest for a larger, heavier pursuer to follow. Her breath came in controlled bursts, visible in the cold air. "No need to run, girl," the trapper's voice echoed through the trees. "Just want to talk. Been a long winter, could use some company." The words sent ice through her veins colder than any mountain wind. Grace pushed harder, grateful for the strength weeks of hard living had built in her legs. She could hear him crashing through the brush behind her, no longer trying for stealth. The canyon edge appeared suddenly, a dizzying drop to the frozen creek below. Grace didn't hesitate. She'd made this crossing before, knew where the fallen log bridged the gap. Her boots found purchase on the icy bark, arms spread for balance as she crossed. Behind her, the trapper skidded to a stop. "You're crazy, girl. Come back here before you fall." Grace reached the other side and turned. The trapper stood at the canyon edge, clearly unwilling to risk the crossing. His face was red with exertion and frustration. "Smart girl," he called across. "But you gotta come back sometime. I'll be waiting. Gets mighty cold out here alone." She didn't respond, simply melted back into the trees. But her hands shook as the immediate danger passed. The sanctuary of the mountains had been breached, Someone else knew she was here. Grace took a circuitous route back to the cabin, doubling back several times to ensure she wasn't followed. The sun was setting by the time she arrived, painting the snow pink and gold. Ezra was outside, splitting wood, but something in her approach made him stop mid-swing. What happened? He didn't waste words on pleasantries, reading the story in her stance and expression. "Trapper, following my tracks from the snare line." Grace set down the rabbits, trying to keep her voice steady. "I lost him at Devil's Canyon." Ezra's expression darkened. "Describe him?" Grace did, noting every detail she'd observed. Ezra listened without interruption, but she saw his jaw tighten progressively. "Jake Thornton," he said when she finished. "Runs traps north of here, but he's more scavenger than hunter. Takes what he wants, whether it's pelts or other things. He knows I'm here now." "Yes." Ezra set aside the axe. "Come inside. We need to talk." The cabin felt smaller somehow, the walls that had seemed so protective now feeling fragile against the knowledge that their isolation had been compromised. Ezra stoked the fire while Grace skinned the rabbits, both using the familiar tasks to settle their thoughts. "He'll be back," Ezra said finally. "Men like Thornton don't give up easy when they think they've found something worth taking." "I won't bring trouble to you," Grace said quickly. "I can leave. Head further into the mountains." "You'll do no such thing." The firmness in Ezra's voice surprised them both. He moderated his tone. "Running in winter is death, and you know it. Besides, this stopped being just about you the moment you walked through that door." Grace looked up from her work. Meeting his eyes, "What are you saying?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, seeming to wrestle with words. Finally, he moved around the table, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I'm saying that somewhere between teaching you to set snares and watching you beat me at chess, I started caring what happens to you." His hand moved to her face, calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. "I'm saying that I'll put a bullet in Jake Thornton before I let him lay a hand on you." Grace's breath caught. The knife slipped from her fingers, clattering on the table. "Ezra, I know I've got no right," he continued, voice rough. "I'm just a broken man hiding in the mountains, and you deserve better than—" Grace silenced him by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. For a heartbeat, he stood frozen. Then his arms came around her, pulling her against him with a desperate tenderness that spoke of loneliness too long endured. The kiss was like everything about Ezra, careful at first, then deeper as walls crumbled. Grace felt tears on her cheeks, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the unexpected sweetness of finding this here, when she'd thought that part of her heart had been branded away along with her innocence. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, Ezra rested his forehead against hers. "Grace Morrison, you are going to be the death of me, better than the life you are living," she whispered back. He laughed, a rusty sound that seemed to surprise him. "Can't argue with that." They stood there in the firelight, holding each other, while outside the wind picked up and snow began to fall again. Grace knew the danger hadn't passed. Thornton was out there somewhere, a threat that would need to be faced. But in this moment, in Ezra's arms, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before her parents died, the sense of being exactly where she belonged. "What happens now?" she asked. Now we eat supper and plan for tomorrow. Thornton won't try anything tonight, too cold, and he's not equipped for it. But come daylight, we need to be ready." They worked together preparing the meal, but the atmosphere had changed. Every accidental touch sparked awareness. Every glance held weight. When Ezra's hand covered hers as she reached for a plate, neither pulled away. "I need to tell you something," Grace said as they sat down to eat. "That day you found me, I was ready to die. The cold, the shame, the loss of everything I'd known. It seemed like too much to bear. And now, Grace thought of all she'd learned in these weeks, not just the practical skills, but the deeper lessons about strength and survival and the possibility of rebirth. Now I want to live, not just survive, but really live. Is that foolish? No more foolish than a man thinking he could spend the rest of his days alone and be content with it. Ezra reached across the table, taking her hand. Whatever comes tomorrow, we face it together. Agreed? Agreed. They spent the evening making preparations. Ezra cleaned and checked both rifles, ensuring Grace's aim was true. He showed her defensive positions around the cabin, places where cover was good and sight lines clear. They discussed contingency plans with the calm practicality of people who had learned to face harsh realities head-on. But when the fire burned low and it came time for sleep, a new tension filled the room. Grace stood by her usual pallet, uncertain. Everything had changed with that kiss, those admissions of feeling. "Grace," Ezra said softly. She turned to find him holding out a hand. "Stay with me tonight. Just stay." She went to him without hesitation. They lay together fully clothed on his narrow bed, Grace's head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. His arms encircled her, one hand stroking her hair with infinite gentleness. "Tell me about after," Grace said into the darkness. "After Thornton, after winter. What happens to us?" "I've been thinking on that." His chest rumbled with his voice. "There's a town 2 valleys over, Silver Creek, bigger than Redemption Creek. More travelers passing through. Less likely to ask questions about a woman's past if she arrives as a married woman." Grace's heart skipped. "Is that a proposal? Ezra Hawkins?" "It's a practical solution," he said, but she could hear the smile in his voice. "Also happens to be what I want more than anything I've wanted in 5 years. But I figured you should know all your options." "What are my other options?" "Stay here, unmarried, and scandalize the mountains. Head to California come spring and start fresh. Find yourself a younger man without so much baggage." He paused. "Though I'd have to track him down and shoot him. So maybe that's not the best option." Grace laughed. "The sound, bright in the darkness." "I choose the practical solution, though I notice you haven't actually asked the question." Ezra shifted, turning so he could see her face in the dim light from the banked fire. "Grace Morrison, you came into my life like a wounded angel and made me remember what it was to hope. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I can't offer much, just these hands, this cabin, and a heart that was frozen solid until you thawed it, but they're yours if you'll have them." "Yes," Grace whispered, her throat tight with emotion. "Yes, Ezra. 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then, sealing the promise. When they finally settled back into each other's arms, Grace felt a peace she hadn't known was possible. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Thornton, danger, the need to defend what they'd found. But tonight, she was no longer branded and bound for shame. She was simply Grace, beloved of Ezra, facing an uncertain future with a certain heart. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her lips. "And I love you," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Branded and bound for shame, yet your heart is free, and my desire is yours. Forever, if you'll have it." "Forever," she agreed, and meant it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering their tracks and hiding their small cabin from the world. But inside, 2 hearts that had known too much pain found healing in each other. And love bloomed like a wildflower in winter. Unexpected. Impossible. And absolutely true. Dawn came pale and cold. The sky a washed-out gray that promised more snow. Grace woke in Ezra's arms, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar warmth and comfort. Then memory returned. Thornton, the chase, Ezra's proposal, and with it, a mixture of joy and apprehension. "Morning," Ezra murmured against her hair. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years." She turned to face him, still marveling at the change in his features when he looked at her, the softness that tempered his usual vigilance. "What's the plan?" "First, breakfast. Then we prepare." His expression grew serious. "Thornton will come today. Men like him don't wait when they think they've found easy prey." They rose and dressed quickly, the morning routine now charged with purpose. Grace noticed Ezra positioning weapons within easy reach, a rifle by the door, another by the window. her knife on the table where she could grab it quickly. "I've been thinking," Grace said as she prepared coffee. "What if we went to him first? Caught him off guard?" Ezra considered this. Not a bad thought, but Thornton knows these mountains too. Better to defend ground we know than hunt him on his terms. They were finishing breakfast when they heard it, the distant crack of a branch, too deliberate to be wildlife. Ezra was on his feet instantly. Rifle in hand, he moved to the window, peering out through a gap in the heavy curtains. "Two of them," he said quietly. "Thornton and another man, coming from the north." Grace's heart hammered, but her hands were steady as she picked up the second rifle. "Who's the other?" "Can't tell yet, but two changes things." Ezra moved with quick efficiency, positioning Grace at the east window. "They'll try to split us, come from different angles. You watch this side. Anyone comes into view, you shoot to wound if you can, kill if you must. Understood?" "Understood." Grace checked the rifle's load, settling it against her shoulder. The weight felt natural now, an extension of her will to survive. "Grace," Ezra touched her face briefly. "Whatever happens, know that last night meant everything to me. We're going to have many more nights," she said firmly. "This isn't the end of our story." He smiled grimly. "No, it's not." The waiting was agony. Snow began to fall, thick flakes that would muffle sound and obscure vision. Grace kept her position, scanning the tree line, every shadow potentially hiding danger. "Hello, the cabin." Thornton's voice rang out, closer than expected. "Just want to talk. No need for unpleasantness." Ezra didn't respond. Teaching Grace through example, let them reveal themselves, show their positions. "Come now. Hawkins, I know you're in there. Saw the smoke from your chimney, and I know you've got that pretty little thing I tracked yesterday." Grace's jaw clenched at being reduced to a thing, but she maintained her vigilance. "Here's what I'm thinking," Thornton continued, his voice carrying false friendliness. "That girl's a runaway, probably wanted somewhere. There might be a reward. We could split it, friendly-like. You've had your fun with her. Now let others have a turn at profit." The casual assumption in his words made Grace's skin crawl. Beside her, she saw Ezra's knuckles whiten on his rifle stock. "Or maybe," Thornton's voice took on an edge, "she's that branded thief from Redemption Creek. Heard tell they marked a girl for stealing. Drove her out into the snow. Now that would be interesting, wouldn't it? Harboring a criminal could go badly for you." "Hawkins." Movement caught Grace's eye, a figure trying to circle around to her side of the cabin. The second man, moving low through the snow. She tracked him with her rifle, waiting for a clear shot. "Last chance, Hawkins. Send her out, and we'll be on our way. No harm to you." Ezra finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the walls. "The lady is under my protection. Thornton. Any man who thinks different will find himself feeding the wolves. That's your only warning." "Protection?" Thornton laughed ugly. "What's a broken-down ex-soldier protecting? Your own interests. More like, well, we'll see about." The second man made his move, rushing toward Grace's window. She fired, the rifle bucking against her shoulder. The man cried out, spinning and falling into the snow, clutching his thigh. All pretense of negotiation vanished. Thornton roared profanities, opening fire on the cabin. Bullets thudded into the thick logs, showering splinters. Grace dropped below the window as glass shattered above her. "You all right?" Ezra called out, returning fire through his window. "Fine." Grace reloaded with hands that barely trembled. The wounded man was trying to crawl to cover, leaving a red trail in the white snow. She felt a distant sort of pity, but no regret. He'd made his choice when he joined Thornton's assault. The firefight was brief but intense. Thornton had taken cover behind a woodpile, firing sporadically. Ezra was patient, waiting for his shots, making each one count. Grace watched her side, ensuring the wounded man didn't try anything desperate. Then, sudden silence. The snow continued to fall, covering the violence with pristine white. Minutes stretched like hours. "Thornton's moving," Ezra murmured. heading for the trees, leaving his friend behind. They waited until they were certain he was gone. Then Ezra cautiously opened the door. The wounded man lay moaning in the snow, his rifle well out of reach. "Please," the man gasped as they approached. "Don't leave me to die. I got family." Grace recognized him now. Bill Patterson from Redemption Creek, a hand at the livery stable. He'd been in the crowd when she was branded, had spat at her feet as she passed. "You remember me, Bill?" she asked quietly. His eyes widened in recognition and fear. But Thornton said..." "Said what? That I was fair game? That a branded woman deserved whatever came to her?" Grace knelt beside him, examining the wound. The bullet had passed through the meat of his thigh, painful but not fatal if treated. "Ezra, bring bandages." Patterson stared at her as she worked to stop the bleeding. "Why? After Because I'm not what you branded me," Grace said simply. "Never was. The real thief confessed 3 days ago, according to that traitor who came through last week. Silas Brennan's own nephew, stealing to pay gambling debts." The man's face went white, and not just from blood loss. "We didn't know. You didn't care to know. Easier to blame the outsider, the woman with no protection." Grace finished binding the wound with efficient movements. "You'll live if infection doesn't set in. Can you ride?" I think so." Ezra had retrieved Patterson's horse, which had been tied in the trees, together. They helped the wounded man into the saddle. "You go back to Redemption Creek," Ezra told him. "You tell them what happened here. Tell them Grace Morrison is under my protection, and any man who comes after her will get worse than you did. You tell them about Brennan's nephew, too. Make sure everyone knows the truth." Patterson nodded weakly. "I will. I swear it." He looked at Grace. "I'm sorry. For all of it. That don't mean much, but I'm sorry." Grace stepped back. "Go, before you bleed through those bandages." They watched him ride away, swaying but staying in the saddle. Thornton's tracks led off in another direction. He wouldn't be back. Not alone, not after seeing his partner shot down. Back inside the cabin, Grace found herself shaking as the reality of what had happened sank in. She had shot a man, defended her home and her life, but still, she had pulled the trigger without hesitation. Ezra wrapped his arms around her. "You did what you had to do. No shame in protecting what's yours." "I know, it's just..." She pressed her face against his chest. 6 weeks ago, I was scrubbing floors and trying to be invisible. Now I'm shooting men and planning a future I never imagined. Regrets?" Grace thought about it seriously. "No, not one. I'm just amazed at who I've become. Who you've helped me become." "You were always this strong," Ezra said. "You just needed the chance to show it." They spent the rest of the day repairing damage and reinforcing defenses. Word would spread about what had happened. Some might see it as a challenge, but most would think twice before bothering a woman who could shoot and a man willing to kill for her. As evening fell, they stood together looking out at the pristine snow, all evidence of the morning's violence already erased. "Do you really think Patterson will tell them about the nephew?" Grace asked. "He might. Guilt's a powerful motivator." Ezra pulled her closer. "But it doesn't matter now. That life is finished. You can't go back to being who you were before. I don't want to go back, but..." Grace touched her shoulder where the brand lay hidden. "This will always be there. Even if my name is cleared, I'll carry this mark forever. We all carry marks," Ezra said quietly. "Some visible, some not. They're not who we are, just maps of where we've been. What matters is where we're going." Grace turned in his arms, looking up at his weathered face. "Where are we going?" "Ezra Hawkins." "Forward," he said simply. "Together, beyond the reach of small men and their smaller ideas of justice. We'll make our own life, our own law, and anyone who tries to stop us will learn what Patterson learned today, that Grace Morrison is nobody's victim, not anymore." The truth of it settled into Grace's bones like warmth from a fire. She had been branded and bound for shame, but that woman was gone. In her place stood someone harder, stronger, and infinitely more free. Someone who could face down her past and choose her future. "I love you," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "And I love you." Ezra replied, "My wild mountain woman, my unexpected salvation." They went inside as snow began to fall again, covering tracks and erasing history. Tomorrow they would begin preparations for their journey to Silver Creek, where they would marry and start fresh. There would be challenges. There always were on the frontier. But they would face them together. Two souls who had found each other in the wilderness and discovered that sometimes the greatest freedom comes from choosing who to be bound to. The brand on Grace's shoulder would remain, but it no longer defined her. She had written her own definition in gunpowder and grit, in love and leather-hard determination. She was Grace Morrison, soon to be Grace Hawkins, and her heart was finally, truly free. The journey back to Redemption Creek took 3 days through melting snow and muddy trails. Grace rode beside Ezra, her back straight, wearing the confidence of her new self like armor. The woman who had fled this town in shame was gone. In her place rode someone who had faced death and found love in the wilderness. As they crested the final ridge, the town spread below them in the afternoon sun. Nothing had changed. The same weathered buildings, the same muddy main street, the same people going about their business. But Grace saw it all differently now, with eyes that had learned to read truth beneath pretense. "You sure about this?" Ezra asked, though they discussed it thoroughly. "We could bypass the town, head straight to Silver Creek." "No," Grace said firmly. "I won't slink away like I'm guilty. They need to see me, hear the truth from my own lips. I owe that to myself." They rode down Main Street as the sun touched the mountains. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Grace saw recognition dawn on familiar faces, followed by shock, confusion, and in some cases fear. Word of the confrontation with Thornton and Patterson had clearly spread. Outside the Mercantile, Mrs. Hartley dropped her shopping basket. The banker's son, Tom Sullivan, stood frozen on the boardwalk. And there, emerging from his store with a ledger in hand, was Silas Brennan himself. The merchant's face went through several transformations: surprise, anger, and finally something like panic as he saw who rode beside Grace. Ezra Hawkins was known in Redemption Creek, his story a cautionary tale about crossing the wrong people. "Sheriff Morton," Brennan called out, his voice higher than usual. "These people are going about their lawful business." Ezra cut in, his hand resting casually near his rifle. "Unless you've got evidence otherwise." Sheriff Morton emerged from his office, taking in the scene with calculating eyes. He was a practical man who understood which way the wind was blowing. Patterson's testimony, combined with rumors about Brennan's nephew, had shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. "Miss Morrison," the sheriff said carefully. "Ezra, heard you folks had some trouble with Jake Thornton." "Trouble's one word for it," Ezra replied. "Man tried to assault Miss Morrison, then brought violence to our door." "He's lucky to have ridden away breathing." A crowd was gathering now, drawn by the drama. Grace spotted familiar faces, other girls from the boarding house, men who had jeered at her branding, Judge Crane himself standing in the doorway of the courthouse. "I've come to address a wrong," Grace said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. 6 weeks ago, I was branded a thief based on lies and planted evidence, cast out to die in the snow for a crime I didn't commit. "Now see here," Brennan started, but Grace continued over him. "Your nephew, Mr. Brennan, young Marcus, where is he now?" The merchant's face flushed. "That's none of your... Gone to California, isn't he? Left rather suddenly." "Just after my trial. Just after Bill Patterson started asking questions about who really had access to your office." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Grace saw doubt creeping into faces that had been so certain of her guilt. Judge Crane stepped forward, his righteousness somewhat dimmed. "These are serious accusations. Miss Morrison, do you have proof?" "Do I have proof?" Grace laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's rich, coming from you. What proof did you have against me? besides a watch conveniently found by a sheriff who knew exactly where to look. She dismounted, standing tall despite the memories this place evoked. But yes, I have proof. Patterson saw Marcus Brennan leaving your store the night before the watch was discovered. The same Patterson who lies wounded in his bed, shot for participating in an attack on innocent people. She's lying, Brennan sputtered. This is all— Ask him yourself, Grace interrupted. Ask Patterson what he saw. Ask why Marcus left town so suddenly. Ask why your books don't balance. Mr. Brennan, how much did he steal before you decided to blame someone else? The merchant's guilty flinch told the story better than any confession. The crowd saw it too, and the murmur grew louder. You branded me, Grace continued, her voice rising with long-suppressed anger. Marked me like an animal. Drove me out to die. All to protect your family's reputation. To hide your nephew's crimes. Well, I survived. I more than survived. She pulled back her collar, revealing the scar. Several people gasped. The brand was still vivid, a permanent reminder of their rush to judgment. This is what your justice looks like, Grace said. This is what happens when wealth and connection matter more than truth. But I won't be defined by your mark. I've found my own justice, my own life, beyond the reach of your small minds and smaller morals. Mrs. Pratt from the boarding house pushed through the crowd. Grace, we didn't know. If we had known— You didn't want to know, Grace replied, but without venom. It was easier to believe the worst of a nobody than to question one of your own. Sheriff Morton cleared his throat. Miss Morrison, in light of new information, it seems a terrible mistake was made. If you want to press charges against those responsible— Grace almost laughed. Press charges? In this town, where justice bent like a reed before the wind of influence? The only thing I want from Redemption Creek is what's owed me, she said. My final week's wages from the boarding house, and the possessions that were kept from me. Mrs. Pratt hurried away, returning quickly with a small purse and bundle. It's all here, your mother's Bible, her brooch, and extra for what happened. Grace took the items but left the extra coins. I don't want your guilt money, just what was mine. She turned to address the crowd one final time. Let this be a lesson to all of you. Today it was me. Tomorrow it could be any of you who stands in the way of someone powerful. Remember that the next time you're quick to judge, quick to condemn based on status instead of truth. Her eyes found Judge Crane. And you, who speak so readily of God's law while perverting man's, I hope you think of me every time you pass judgment. I hope you see this brand and remember what your righteousness really looks like. The judge had no response, his face pale beneath his whiskers. Grace remounted her horse, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. One more thing. Ezra and I will be married in Silver Creek next week. We'll make our life honestly, away from here. But know this, we'll defend what's ours. Any man who thinks to trouble us will find what Thornton found. We've moved beyond your reach, but you haven't moved beyond ours. She looked at Ezra, who had watched the entire scene with quiet pride. Ready? Been ready since the day I met you, he replied. They rode out of Redemption Creek as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of redemption. Behind them, the town buzzed with recrimination and revelation. Some would learn from what had happened. Others would simply find new targets for their prejudice. But none of that mattered to Grace anymore. As they left the town limits behind, Ezra reached over to take her hand. That was brave, what you did back there. It needed doing, Grace said simply. Not for them, for me. I needed to face them as who I am now, not who they tried to make me. And who are you now? Grace smiled, feeling the wind on her face and the endless possibility of the frontier before them. I'm a woman who knows her own worth, who can shoot straight and speak truth, who found love in the last place she expected and won't let anyone take it from her. You're also about to be my wife, Ezra reminded her. If you haven't changed your mind after seeing that nest of vipers again. Changed my mind. Ezra Hawkins, you're stuck with me now. For better or worse. Through blizzards and bullets and whatever else these mountains throw at us. They camped that night by a clear mountain stream, far from any town or human judgment. As they sat by their fire, Grace pulled out her mother's Bible, one of the few links to her past life. "She would have liked you," Grace said, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. "My mother, she always said the measure of a man wasn't in his words, but in his actions when no one was watching." What would she have thought of all this? Of what you've become? Grace considered the question. I think she would have understood. She was strong, too, in her quiet way. Faced down drought and disease and never complained. She would have said that sometimes we have to become what the world forces us to be, but we can choose whether that breaks us or makes us stronger. You chose stronger. We both did. They talked late into the night about their future, the life they would build in Silver Creek, the possibility of children someday, the dreams that had seemed impossible when they were both locked in their separate griefs. "I want to tell you something," Ezra said as the fire burned low. "That first night, when I found you in the snow, I almost rode past. I'd trained myself not to get involved, not to care about anyone else's troubles. What changed your mind?" "I heard you crying, not loud, not asking for help, just quiet tears like you were saying goodbye to the world. It reminded me of myself, after I lost everything. I couldn't ride past that kind of pain again." Grace moved into his arms, feeling the solid warmth of him. "I'm glad you stopped. Glad for all of it. Strange as that sounds, even the brand, even the exile, because it led me to you." "Phoenix from the ashes," Ezra murmured. "Both of us." They made love for the first time that night, under stars that seemed to bless their union. It was tender and fierce by turns, two souls recognizing their match in each other. When Grace cried out, it wasn't in pain or shame, but in joy at feeling truly alive. Afterward, they lay entwined, watching the stars wheel overhead. Grace touched the scar on her shoulder, no longer feeling the shame it was meant to inspire. "Do you know what I realized today?" she asked. "They meant this mark to define me forever, to tell everyone who saw it what I was. But they failed." "How's that?" "Because when people see it now, they won't see a thief. They'll see a survivor. They'll see someone who was knocked down and got back up. Someone who found love and life despite their worst intentions." She smiled in the darkness. "In trying to destroy me, they created someone stronger than they could imagine." Ezra kissed her forehead. "Branded and bound for shame, yet your heart broke free." "With the silent hunter's desire," Grace finished. "You gave me back myself. Ezra gave me the chance to become who I was meant to be. We gave each other that chance." They fell asleep holding each other, while the stream sang its ancient song and the mountains stood guard. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new paths to forge. But tonight, they were simply two people who had found their way through darkness to each other, carrying their scars like badges of honor rather than shame. The brand remained, would always remain, but it no longer had power over Grace Morrison. She had taken their mark of shame and transformed it into a symbol of survival, of love found in the most unlikely places, of justice that came not from courts or judges, but from the simple act of refusing to be broken. In the morning, they would continue to Silver Creek and their new life. But this night belonged to them alone, to truth spoken, to wrong acknowledged if not righted, and to the quiet triumph of hearts that had found their match against all odds. Silver Creek proved to be everything Redemption Creek was not. A bustling town where strangers were common and questions about the past were considered impolite. The justice of the peace. A kindly man named Herbert Walsh married Grace and Ezra in his small office with two minors as witnesses. No questions asked about the healing scar visible at Grace's collar. "May your union be blessed with happiness and prosperity," Walsh said after pronouncing them husband and wife, "and may you find in each other the peace that the world sometimes denies us." Grace looked up at her new husband, seeing her joy reflected in his dark eyes. When they kissed, it was a promise sealed, not just of love, but of a future they would build together, far from the judgment and cruelty that had driven them to these mountains. They had decided not to stay in any town, at least not yet. The wilderness had given them both rebirth, and they weren't ready to leave it behind. Instead, they purchased supplies, proper windows for the cabin, tools for expanding, seeds for a garden come spring, and fabric for Grace to make new clothes that bore no memory of her former life. The journey back to their mountain valley took 2 days, the pack mules loaded with their new possessions. Grace rode beside Ezra, marveling at how different the same trail felt now. Before, she had been fleeing, desperate, marked by others' judgment. Now she was returning home, bearing the name of a man who loved her, carrying hope instead of shame. "Look," Ezra pointed to an eagle circling high above them. "That's a good omen. Eagles mate for life, you know. Like us," Grace said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. They arrived at the cabin as sunset painted the mountains in brilliant shades of crimson and gold. Everything was as they'd left it, but Grace saw it with new eyes. This wasn't just a shelter anymore, it was the foundation of their life together. Over the following days, they worked side by side to transform the space. Ezra cut timber while Grace planned improvements. They installed the new windows, letting light flood the previously dim interior. Grace hung curtains she'd sewn from cheerful calico, adding touches of civilization to the frontier roughness. "Never thought I'd see curtains in this place," Ezra said one evening, admiring her handiwork. "Never thought I'd be the kind of woman who could skin a deer and sew curtains in the same day," Grace replied, making him laugh, a sound she never tired of drawing from him. They established new routines, sharing the work of survival but also making time for the small pleasures of married life. Evenings were spent by the fire, reading aloud from the books they'd bought in Silver Creek, playing chess, or simply talking about their dreams for the future. "I want to build a real barn come spring," Ezra said one night. "Maybe get some cattle, start a small ranch. The land here is good for grazing. And I want a garden," Grace added. "Vegetables, herbs, maybe even some flowers. Something beautiful that we've grown ourselves." They were building more than a homestead. They were creating a life of meaning and purpose, far from those who had tried to define them by their lowest moments. One morning, as the first hints of spring began to touch the valley, Grace woke feeling unwell. The nausea passed quickly, but it returned the next day, and the next. When she missed her monthly time, she knew. "Ezra," she said one evening as they sat watching the sunset from their newly built porch, "we're going to need to expand the cabin sooner than we thought." He looked at her questioningly. Then understanding dawned in his eyes. "You mean, by autumn, there'll be 3 of us?" The joy on his face was like sunrise after the longest night. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of spun glass. "A child. Our child." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, though she could see the answer in every line of his body. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it." He kissed her tenderly. "I thought my life was over when I lost my first family. Never imagined I'd get a second chance at everything I'd dreamed of." They began preparing for the baby with the same determination they'd brought to every other challenge. Ezra crafted a cradle with careful hands, carving tiny bears and deer into the headboard. Grace sewed small clothes and blankets, humming the lullabies her mother had sung to her. As her pregnancy progressed and movement became more difficult, Grace found herself spending more time on the porch, watching the valley come alive with spring. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in purple and gold, just as Ezra had promised. Deer brought their spotted fawns to graze in the early morning. Life bloomed everywhere, echoing the life growing within her. One afternoon, as she sat sewing tiny garments, Grace heard horses approaching. She reached for the rifle. Old habits died hard, then relaxed as she recognized the lead rider. It was Herbert Walsh, the justice of the peace from Silver Creek, accompanied by a younger man she didn't know. "Mrs. Hawkins," Walsh called out cheerfully. "Hope we're not intruding. This is Dr. Samuel Carter, new to Silver Creek, making rounds to meet the folks in the outlying areas." Grace welcomed them, grateful for the company and especially for the doctor's visit. He examined her with professional kindness, pronouncing both her and the baby healthy. "You're doing well for someone living so far from town." "Doctor," Carter said, "though I'd feel better if you were closer when your time comes." "I'll be there," Ezra said firmly. "Having returned from hunting, my wife is the strongest person I know, but we'll take no chances." They shared a meal together, the visitors bringing news from the outside world. Grace was amused to learn that Redemption Creek had suffered something of a scandal. Several prominent citizens had been caught in various schemes, the town's reputation tarnished by the revelation of how readily they'd condemned an innocent woman. Judge Crane resigned, Walsh mentioned. Said he needed to seek spiritual guidance after failing in his duties. And that merchant, Brennan, his business dried up after word spread about what he'd done. Grace felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a distant pity. They were part of another life, one that seemed like a half-remembered nightmare now. After the visitors left, promising to return in a month to check on her, Grace and Ezra sat together in the gathering dusk. "No regrets?" Ezra asked, his hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "How could I regret anything that led to this?" Grace replied, "To you, to our child, to this life we've built." She touched the scar on her shoulder, hidden now beneath the soft fabric of a dress made with love rather than mere necessity. "They tried to mark me with shame, to bind me to their definition of who I was, but all they did was free me to find my true self." "And what did you find?" Grace smiled, feeling the baby move beneath her heart. "I found that I'm stronger than I knew, that love can bloom in the harshest ground, that sometimes we need to lose everything to discover what really matters." "You found me," Ezra said softly, "just as I found you." Two broken people who made each other whole. As summer gave way to early autumn, the aspens turning gold against the evergreens, Grace went into labor, true to his word. Doctor. Carter had returned for the final weeks, staying in a tent near the cabin. With his help and Ezra's steady presence, Grace brought their daughter into the world as dawn broke over the mountains. "She's perfect," Ezra whispered, cradling the tiny bundle with hands that trembled. "What shall we call her?" Grace looked at her daughter, their daughter, and knew. "Hope, Hope Elizabeth Hawkins, because that's what she represents. Hope born from despair, beauty from ashes, love from loss." As she nursed her daughter for the first time, Grace marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From the farmhouse in Kansas to the false comfort of Redemption Creek, through pain and branding and exile, to this moment of perfect joy. Every step, every scar, every tear had led to this. "You know what I think?" she said to Ezra, who couldn't seem to stop staring at their daughter in wonder. "I think everything happened exactly as it was meant to. If I hadn't been branded, I wouldn't have fled. If I hadn't fled, you wouldn't have found me. If you hadn't found me, we wouldn't have this." Ezra finished. "Our own little miracle." They sat together in their cabin, now truly a home, as the sun climbed over the peaks. Outside, the valley stretched green and gold, full of promise. The eagles circled high above, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, no longer a sound of threat, but simply another voice in the wilderness they'd claimed as their own. Grace looked down at her daughter, then at her husband, and finally out at the vast, beautiful world they'd carved from hardship and heartache. She had been branded and bound for shame, marked as worthless by those who thought they knew the measure of justice. But her heart had broken free, had found its match in a silent hunter's desire, and together they had written a new story. The scar remained on her shoulder. It would always remain. But now it was merely one mark among many that told the story of her life. The calluses from honest work. The stretch marks from carrying hope beneath her heart. The laugh lines beginning to form around her eyes from joy hard won but deeply felt. "What are you thinking?" Ezra asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I'm thinking," Grace said slowly, "that I'm exactly where I belong. That sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the worst curses. And that I love you more than words can say." "Show me then," he said with a smile. We have a lifetime to find ways beyond words. As little hope slept peacefully between them, Grace and Ezra held each other close, two souls who had wandered through darkness to find their light. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to their triumph over tragedy, their choice of love over bitterness, their determination to forge their own path in a world that had tried to break them. They had both been branded by loss, Ezra by the murder of his first family, Grace by the false accusation and physical mark of shame. But in the end, those brands had led them to each other, to this valley, to this life they never could have imagined when they were trapped in their separate sorrows. The sun climbed higher, warming the cabin, blessing the little family who had found their happily ever after not in fairy tale endings, but in the hard-won peace of daily choice, daily love, daily refusal to be defined by anything other than their own truth. And in that light, even old scars looked like badges of honor, proof of battles fought and won on the way to joy. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Grace and Ezra's journey touched your heart as much as it did mine. Where are you listening to this story from? Please comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to our From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about this tale of redemption and love. Did this story of overcoming shame and finding unexpected love in the wilderness resonate with you? I'd love to hear your perspective.